walking with eyes closed. Allow me to recount a hair-raising supernatural event I personally experienced. I can't recall the exact year or day, but it happened one early morning when I was in the 4th or 5th grade of elementary school. At that time, my family was not well off, so I had to wake up before dawn to embark on the long journey to school. The path I took was winding and twisted, sometimes passing by someone's front door, other times you couldn't see a single house for minutes on end. Unknown to my parents, I was extremely timid from a young age. As I never mentioned it to them, they naturally thought I wasn't scared. Despite their hard work to provide a better life for me, I had to walk to and from school by myself since 1st or 2nd grade, as there were no other children my age nearby. The closest kids were a neighbor's son, 3 years younger than me, and a daughter, 1 year older, but 2 grades above me. Among my classmates, my home was the farthest down this secluded path, often meaning I had to walk alone, something I was very afraid of. As a child, I was afraid of encountering snakes on the path during summer, and I dreaded the fork in the road that led to school. One path was a long, open road with no houses in sight, the other a shortcut winding past each household's front door. I often hesitated, not because I was embarrassed to walk past people's homes, but because the shortcut meant potentially dealing with dogs. If lucky, the dogs were tethered, and you could pass by safely. If not, you might round a corner to find a dog lying in your path, its leash sprawled across the ground. In such cases, I had no choice but to run, hoping to escape before it noticed me. The gamble of the shortcut was dozens of dogs, and unfortunately, I experienced being chased and even bitten. Now, as an adult, I fear the silence of winter nights and the sound of the wind howling through the forest, sometimes sounding like angry shouts, other times like sorrowful weeping. Walking along that seemingly endless path alone, with no streetlights and no visible houses, knowing my parents were waiting for me at home, I would hum songs to myself to be less afraid. Despite my caution, the most terrifying experience occurred right in front of my own home. Sorry, I've digressed a bit. I have many stories and thoughts I want to share, especially about my childhood. But let's focus on this particular experience. It was a summer morning, and I had to leave for school before dawn. Half asleep, I stepped out the door and down the stone steps when suddenly, a bold idea crossed my mind, walking with my eyes closed. However, only a few steps in, something felt terribly wrong. I felt one foot solidly hit the ground, and the next step was into emptiness. Panicked, I quickly opened my eyes and steadied myself, just in time to prevent falling into the river. How could I unknowingly walk towards the riverbank, which even with eyes open, would require dozens of steps from my front door? This made my skin crawl. I didn't dare think further and ran all the way to school. It's only in the face of the unknown that one feels truly unsettled, and that morning I was filled with unease and fear. That night after school, I remained troubled by the incident, walking back and forth from my house to the riverbank with my eyes open, confirming it was impossible to have reached it with my eyes closed in just a few steps. But why I arrived there with my eyes closed after only a few steps, I couldn't explain and didn't dare to investigate further. By midnight, I started running a high fever, and no amount of medicine or injections from the clinic could help. I burned with fever for 3 days until my parents took me to see a local healer overnight. Miraculously, I recovered the next day, though I never understood how she cured me. My mother mentioned something about burning paper and drinking ash-infused water as part of the treatment, believing my fever was caused by fright. Years later, I've only shared this story with 2 people. One of them is my partner, a strong and understanding woman. Despite my efforts to show and explain everything that happened that day, I could sense that while she was captivated by my story, deep down, she still harbored doubts. This isn't surprising, as truly understanding someone's fears and experiences requires empathy beyond words. I don't know if you'll believe all this, but believe me, everyone harbors some unknown stories in their heart, just as I'm sharing this one with you now. Cold abyss. On a dark summer night, my father shared with me a spine-chilling true experience. It was a terrifying encounter he had when he was 18 years old. At that time, it was common for young people to start working early. By 18, my father was already a diligent worker, well versed in life's challenges. He was a young man brimming with energy, passionate about various physical activities, especially swimming. In his hometown, there was a place known to locals as Ghost Lake, where the waters were clear to the bottom yet always carried an inexplicable chill and a hint of mystery. As the afternoon sun began to slant, my father would head to the lake with his friends, immersing themselves in the aquatic world to escape the mundane clamor. During one diving adventure, my father accidentally stepped on something unusually soft and cold. The murky waters obscured his vision, so he called over his friends to help haul this mysterious object to shore. To their horror, they discovered it was a bloated, unrecognizable corpse, a scene straight out of a horror movie that sent them scattering in panic. Knowing such a matter couldn't be left unresolved, my father decided to report the incident to the police, leaving the ensuing matters in the hands of the law. That night, as my father made his way home, the moonlight seemed feeble behind him, and he felt an indescribable heaviness, as if an invisible force was pulling at every step. The ancient family house, overshadowed by a taller building, seemed trapped in perpetual gloom and dampness, adding to my father's already heavy heart. Upon arriving home, my father didn't touch any food and went straight to bed, falling into a deep sleep. Seeing this, his grandfather thought he was merely exhausted and did not disturb him, opting to rest early himself. However, the tranquility of the night was shattered by sudden noises of my father trying to open the locked door, mumbling repeatedly, "I must go." After witnessing these strange behaviors a few times, his grandfather began to suspect that something unclean was possessing my father. As these nocturnal episodes recurred, my father's actions became increasingly bizarre. He would make odd gestures towards the family's water tank, as if communicating with unseen entities. On one alarming occasion, he nearly jumped into the tank, but fortunately, his grandfather intervened in time. Back then, people's understanding and handling of supernatural phenomena were vastly different from today. To rid my father of this terrifying entanglement, a well-known local medium was summoned. She was a woman adept at healing and protection through ancient rituals and prayers, her methods shrouded in mystery yet widely accepted within the community. On a night filled with ritualistic ambiance, she set up a small altar at the house's entrance and burned papers symbolizing purification and protection. As my father attempted to cross the threshold, he found himself unable to move forward, as if an invisible wall was blocking his path. The medium gently applied a special mixture to my father's forehead, a substance symbolizing purification and protection in Western traditions. Subsequently, my father passed out, awakening later with the oppressive feeling gone, as if everything that had happened was but a dream. It was said that the unfortunate soul had once met a tragic fate by the lake, dragged into the waters by an unseen force, and had lingered there ever since. This experience not only exhausted my father physically and mentally, but also deeply impressed upon him that some elements in the unseen world should not be taken lightly. Whenever he recounts this tale, he does so with an almost reverential caution, reminding us to approach the unknown with respect and prudence. Hide and seek. I was born in the early 1990s in a rural area of Pennsylvania, USA. It's well known that kids in the countryside often play in a more free and wild manner. Back then, the power supply in the countryside was tight at night, often cutting off from 4 in the afternoon until after midnight. This period coincided with our return home from school and dinner time, and we could almost finish our homework before the sun set around 7:30 to 8 o'clock. At night, with a lack of entertainment in the countryside, people would usually gather in the street after dinner. The women would chat together until after midnight before going to sleep, and us kids would play in the streets to our heart's content. This incident occurred against such a backdrop. Looking back now, it feels incredibly surreal. The fright at the time made my memory particularly hazy, as if watching someone else through a mirror, giving a sense of displacement. I remember it was a very comfortable summer evening. I was about 8 or 9 years old. After dinner, my classmates and I were running around in the street, the adults too, busy chatting to pay much attention to us. As it got dark, We could barely see each other's outlines, unable to tell who was who without speaking. It's unclear who suggested playing hide and seek, but after a few rounds, it was my classmate's younger brother's turn to be it. His sister and I hid on either side of their house's door, me on one side, she on the other. After hiding, I sneakily glanced her way, feeling like there were two people hiding beside her. However, since the game had already started, I didn't think much of it. Soon we were all found. But her brother saw her from a distance and, unable to keep quiet, immediately shouted, "Sis, come out, I see you. Who's behind you? I see you too, come out, don't try to cheat." Both she and I came out thinking he was calling to me, so I followed suit. We didn't dwell on it at the time. After he found a few more people, the game ended, and by the rules, the first person found had to be it in the next round. Next, it was her turn to be it, and the rest of us began to hide. Her brother followed me, asking, "Why were you two so silly, hiding together?" I replied, "No, it was just me by myself, and her by herself. Besides, that spot by the door is too small for two people to hide." While I was still hiding, I suddenly heard her sister crying very loudly. Her brother and I, puzzled, looked at her crying alone and ran over to see why. The adults noticed too, thinking we were fighting. She said her arm hurt. "It really hurts. It really hurts." Her mom came over to ask what happened, and she explained that while hiding, she felt someone grab her arm, which didn't hurt much at first, but now was very painful. Her mom was confused, asking me who had grabbed her, but I had no idea since we were hiding separately and I hadn't touched her. Before I could finish, she told her mom she couldn't lift her arm because it hurt so much. Her brother also started to hurt, leading to bouts of crying and screaming. Their mom, looking worried, said they needed to see a doctor at the clinic. As we were about to leave, both of them were writhing in pain on the ground, screaming about their stomachs hurting. Their cries of agony were piercing and frightening. Seeing the situation was serious, everyone prepared to call a doctor, but just as we were about to leave, she and her brother suddenly stopped crying. The adults quickly carried them home, where both seemed lifeless, their chests showing no signs of breathing. Her mom started crying, and an experienced old lady suggested that they might have bumped into something, meaning they encountered a ghost in our area. I was young at the time, watching the adults cry and panic, feeling both mystified and scared. Her mom then asked me, "Where were you playing just now? Did you see anything?" I was so panicked I could hardly remember anything. Her mom urged me to say anything I saw, not to leave anything out. I recounted the events in full, not fully understanding the concept of ghosts at that time. The old lady then suggested calling her grandmother, a well-known witch in our area who usually worked at the funeral home applying makeup to the deceased. My mom had always forbidden me from playing at her house. Around 10 o'clock at night, her mom brought her grandmother to our house. Upon entering, her grandmother immediately said the doorstep needed to be removed, then went to see her and her brother. By then, both were unconscious, their mom worried and scared, her face pale, lips trembling. Her grandmother instructed their dad to bring the children's usual bowls, a kitchen knife, paper money, mugwort, and freshly drawn well water. She poured a mouthful of well water into each child's bowl, had them drink it, then overturned the bowls and split them in half with the knife, lightly cutting their collars with the knife afterward. They stopped crying and fussing. In less than 5 minutes, their breathing stabilized and they stopped complaining of pain, falling into a deep sleep. The family then burned the paper money and mugwort at home. Afterwards, they had us onlookers leave, hitting our bodies with mugwort and instructing us to wash our hands at the doorstep before going home. The next day, her mom came to our house to thank us for our help and said she had made some delicious food, delivering a bowl of meat to each household. After arriving, she started talking about the previous day's events. I was sitting nearby, doing homework, eavesdropping on their conversation. She mentioned how fortunate it was that her grandmother arrived in time. Otherwise, the children might not have been saved. It turns out that playing the previous day had attracted a ghost's attention. The ghost was possibly one of their uncles, who about a month earlier had been crushed to death by a train while working on the railway. His arm severed and his internal organs shattered. Since he was buried without all his organs, his stomach was filled with cotton. He had come to visit his family and wanted to take the children with him, leading to the incident. My mom asked how they knew it was their uncle. Her mom said that after we left the previous night, the children woke up in the middle of the night saying they had dreamt their uncle was playing with them, taking them to his house. But when they arrived at their uncle's house, they found everything was made of paper. They heard someone calling them outside, and upon going out, they woke up. Her grandmother said it was their uncle missing them. He had loved them the most while alive, and they had not attended his funeral. Now he wanted them by his side. Hearing this, her mom cried. Since then, I rarely played at their house, perhaps out of fear. This is the story of my experience. Although my retelling may be a bit rambling and might not sound as scary, it's something I personally went through. Only those who have experienced it can truly understand the fear and incredulity it brings. Uninvited.
A few days ago was the eve of Halloween, recognized in Western countries as the night when spirits are most active. During a leisurely afternoon tea, my friends and I sat around sharing some hair-raising stories. Among these, I recounted a personal experience. Despite being educated in a scientific mindset, I'm reluctant to believe in the supernatural, yet I couldn't find a logical explanation for this particular incident. This event took place in 2009, right when I had just started my career. The lease on the apartment I shared with a colleague was about to expire. When my colleague moved to another city for a job opportunity, I couldn't afford the rent on my own and temporarily moved in with my boyfriend, Ethan. We both worked at the same company, he in the international department, and I in the domestic marketing department. Ethan's rented apartment was conveniently close to our workplace. It was a 3-bedroom flat with 1 room for Ethan, 1 for our roommate, and 1 for me. At that time, Ethan and I had just started our relationship and were not living together yet, so we kept our separate rooms. The apartment was in an old neighborhood, previously designated for city committee officials, featuring a pleasant environment and comprehensive facilities. Nothing seemed amiss when I first moved in. Ethan often worked late, so coming home around 8 or 9 o'clock was the norm for him, and sometimes even later when he was chasing deadlines. Since I finished work earlier, I'd usually watch TV on the sofa after dinner, waiting for him to come home, often falling asleep there. However, as time went by, things started to feel a bit off. On nights when Ethan was working late to meet month-end targets, I'd fall asleep on the couch and have a recurring dream. In the dream, a group of people would suddenly enter our home, acting as though they were very familiar with me, enthusiastically chatting and saying, "Let's go, we need to hurry, or we'll be late." They would even try to pull me along as if there was some urgent matter that needed immediate attention. Strangely, I didn't recognize any of these seemingly familiar faces. I felt an intense fear and resistance, lying on the sofa, trying hard not to open my eyes or look at them, hoping to use my body's weight to resist their pulling. Often, while struggling, a loud bang would suddenly occur, and all the people around me would vanish, and I'd open my eyes. Ethan had come home, and the noise was him opening the door. This dream would recur every few weeks, with the most extreme instance being pulled into midair. I tried to turn around, wanting to lie back on the sofa, but I caught a glimpse from the corner of my eye that I was still lying there peacefully. At that moment, an overwhelming fear gripped me. If I was still on the sofa, then who was this in midair? After researching extensively online, most explanations suggested the phenomenon was akin to sleep paralysis, where the body and consciousness do not wake up simultaneously. I shared these experiences with Ethan, who half-jokingly asked if I'd been watching too many horror movies, and even suggested I accompany him on his late-night shifts. I did join him a few times, but couldn't keep up due to fatigue and inconvenience when his department head was present. Subsequently, 2 unsettling incidents convinced me beyond a doubt that we had to move out. One evening in September, Ethan caught a cold and had a fever. I went to a clinic outside our neighborhood to get him some medicine. It was dark, and perhaps due to unfamiliarity with the area, I mistakenly walked towards a different building that, unlike ours, had no storage sheds in front. Realizing my mistake and turning to head back, I noticed the ground felt uneven, as if sloping. That's when I saw it was pitch dark, and the streetlights were off. Taking out my phone to use the flashlight, I was shocked to my core. In front of me was a small, round mound of earth. A grave? I ran back home as fast as I could, completing what would normally be a few minutes' walk in mere seconds. Upon arrival, I slammed the door shut and, without waiting for Ethan to ask, breathlessly exclaimed, "We can't live here. There's a grave in the yard." Ethan, half concerned and half amused, checked my forehead, joking, "Are you the one with a fever, or is it me? Looks like we both need some of this fever reducer." I recounted my experience in detail, and Ethan suggested we check it out the next day, thinking perhaps the darkness had deceived my ease. After a virtually sleepless night, I reluctantly agreed to revisit the spot in broad daylight, hiding behind Ethan. To our astonishment, the area where I had seen the mound was now completely flat. "See, you scared yourself for nothing," Ethan reassured me. "You must have seen it wrong. Maybe it was something someone left there temporarily." I began to doubt myself. Was it really just my imagination? Less than a month later, right before the National Day holiday, our company organized a lunch gathering. Running a bit late, our roommate suggested a shortcut that would get us there faster. Ethan and I followed him towards the south end of our neighborhood. Curious, I asked, "Is there a south exit to this neighborhood?" He explained, "No, there's a vegetable garden to the south. It was supposed to be developed into a green space, but the older residents turned it into a garden instead." Approaching the neighborhood's southern wall, which was quite low, we noticed a few steps that likely facilitated gardeners' access. I easily climbed up, finding myself in an open area with several small vegetable patches. But at the edge of one garden, amid overgrown weeds, lay a grave. This time, I was absolutely certain of what I saw. I dragged Ethan over to show him, insisting, "This is no illusion or hallucination." Ethan seemed bewildered. Our roommate, oblivious to my agitation, quipped, "Is it really that big of a deal? It's just a few graves." I urged everyone to leave immediately. At lunch, Ethan briefly mentioned my encounters to our colleagues, who were initially puzzled but soon showed excitement and curiosity, bombarding me with questions. "Is it really true? Did you make up this story? How do you explain it? Did you run into a ghost? Why haven't I ever encountered something like this? Did you do something wrong?" Their curiosity and thirst for knowledge left me sighing in resignation. There were no further terrifying developments after these incidents. Once the National Day holiday was over, I moved out quickly, and there were no more occurrences thereafter. Over the years, whenever I recall this episode, I wonder, what would have happened if those familiar yet unknown people had actually taken me away? Perhaps there are indeed things in this world that defy explanation yet exist all the same.
Escape from a nightmare. On a cold night sprinkled with stars, as I curled up by the fireplace, surrounded by the faint glow of the fire and dancing shadows, I want to share a story with you. This is not just any tale, but a personal adventure filled with unresolved mysteries and profound family secrets. My father was the youngest of 5 children in a large family. Their father, my grandfather, passed away when my father was still a youth, leaving a void that my elders had to fill. In this web of responsibility and tradition, the eldest brother, whom I refer to as my uncle, naturally assumed the role of the invisible head of the family. My grandmother, a woman shaped by stringent gender biases, lived with my uncle. My memories of her are always tinged with coldness and distance, as if her presence was an insurmountable chasm. One day, a seemingly minor incident revealed the subtle dynamics within our family. My uncle's family had to go out, entrusting me with the temporary custody of their house keys. At the time, I was just an innocent child, Soon my grandmother approached me, attempting to exchange a piece of candy she had for the keys. Her intention was clear, but even in my youth I felt uncomfortable and chose to run away, avoiding this unpleasant transaction. In retrospect, the relationship between our family and my uncles always carried a certain subtle tension. My father worked in a factory and would occasionally bring home small prizes or food. My mother always made sure to share these little fortunes with our neighbors, especially with my uncle's family. Their life was not easy, particularly for my cousins, who always seemed particularly hungry and vulnerable. Despite our modest means, my parents always extended a helping hand. These warm gestures were like rays of sunlight in winter, bright and heartening. However, my feelings towards my grandmother were entirely different. She always seemed so unreachable, as if there was an invisible wall between us. Except on the days when we brought money to her, she seldom visited our home, and I never took the initiative to visit my uncles. In my young mind, her image was vague and distant. Then, in one autumn, a sudden event indelibly marked her image in my memory. The news of my grandmother's death struck like lightning, illuminating the long-hidden secrets within our family shadows. It was said that on the night of her death, everyone gathered at my uncle's house, where the coffin lay quietly in the yard, and my uncle suddenly decided that the children should keep vigil. My father's face was filled with discontent and hesitation, but under the pressure from the family, he reluctantly accepted the arrangement. That night, as I lay in a strange bed, my mind was filled with unease and confusion. In my dream, I stepped out the door into a world painted in shades of gray and yellow. It was eerily quiet, with not even a whisper of wind. Approaching the gate, I saw a large willow tree with a black trunk and drooping leaves, standing guard like a sentinel. Then my grandmother appeared, dressed in a clean, dignified white garment, beckoning me with a wave of her hand. I felt as if an invisible force pulled me towards her. We crossed the village, arriving at a small riverbank. On the opposite side, my grandmother turned and beckoned me to cross. Just as I was about to step forward, a large black dog suddenly appeared by her side, barking furiously at me. Its urgent, fierce barks in the silent world startled me, making me step back. I tried to call out to my grandmother, but she seemed not to hear me, only gesturing more urgently. When I woke up, I found myself in a hospital bed, with my mother sitting beside me, her eyes filled with worry and love. She explained that on that night, I had developed a sudden fever and became delirious. My great-uncle's eldest son had discovered me in time and alerted the adults. My parents rushed me to the hospital, where after several days of treatment, my condition gradually stabilized. This experience felt like a nightmare, both real and surreal. Later, my mother confided that my grandmother had intended to take me away that night. In our family, my sister and I were the only children, and I was the youngest. My mother viewed my grandmother's actions as a selfish choice, but fortunately the appearance of the large black dog might have been my final guardian. From then on, our family no longer spoke of my grandmother, as if she had never existed. I am not a superstitious person, but I believe there are things in this world that cannot be explained with words. This experience was a double-edged sword, making me cherish life more while leaving an eternal question in my heart. Disabled toilet. This is more than just a story, those deeply unsettling true encounters. Ever since graduating from college, my life has been exceedingly ordinary, never having truly encountered any supernatural or horror events far from the norm. I've never been the type to blindly believe in superstitions, nor have I been the type to outright deny the existence of the unknown. I tend to adopt a more straightforward approach to life, not overly obsessing over unexplainable matters. Everything was as usual until one day, a colleague from the office, whom I was quite close to, suddenly suggested doing a bone weight prediction for the future. Before that, I had never even heard of using bone weight for fortune-telling. It sounded interesting, so I told her my birth date. However, the result was not as favorable as I had hoped. My bone weight was only 3 taels and 6 kian, indicating that I was more susceptible to supernatural phenomena. A concept I was skeptical of, considering I had not encountered any such experiences in the past 20+ years. Yet, this prophecy made me ponder past encounters, realizing that perhaps, in the past 20 or more years, I indeed encountered several peculiar events. I just never gave them much thought, nor did I let them linger in my mind, allowing many such experiences to quietly pass by without further contemplation. Let me recall these strange events in chronological order, events that were either experienced by me personally or by those around me, without any exaggeration. The first strange event occurred when I had just started high school. Those of us born in the 80s all know that joining a new school often meant participating in military training organized by the school. Military training in middle school might have involved more basic training on the school playground, but high school training was clearly more rigorous, involving real soldiers training students at a local military base. Our school arranged for us to receive training at a remote base, which seemed to be located in the wilderness, far from the city. Once I boarded the bus to the base, I quickly lost my sense of direction, so I can't tell you exactly where the base was located, only that it was definitely in a rural area. Upon arrival, the base seemed nothing out of the ordinary, with a huge parade ground at the center, flanked by rows of barracks. Interestingly, there was no fence between the base and the not-so-tall mountain behind it, making the mountain accessible as long as one could sneak past the parade ground and instructors' dormitories. The girls, including myself, were assigned to the barracks on one side, and it was then we noticed something odd. There were two women's restrooms within the base, one near our dormitory and the other on the hillside behind the instructors' dormitories. The two buildings looked almost identical from the outside, even prominently marked with the character for woman, despite being less than 200 meters apart. At first, I thought having two such facilities was somewhat redundant. However, during a briefing, our instructor explicitly told us that under no circumstances were we to use the restroom on the hillside, with violators facing severe disciplinary action. Since the instructors' and teachers' dormitories were right next to that particular restroom, curiosity was quelled by the potential for punishment. Everything seemed calm until the last day of training, during the celebratory dinner, when two girls from our group encountered something bone-chilling. This is what happened. On the night of the celebration, the entire base was swallowed by darkness, with only a pale light illuminating the parade ground. Since the dining hall was located next to the boys' dormitory, this meant that any girl needing to use the restroom during the event had to walk a long distance back to our dormitory. These two girls, perhaps out of convenience or defiance, decided to use the normally forbidden restroom on the hillside. Despite being prohibited, and with the restroom shrouded in unsettling darkness, lacking lighting both inside and out, something compelled them to go ahead. Their return was anything but normal. One girl could not comfort herself, tears streaming from her eyes without a sound, her body limp as if all her bones had turned to jelly, unresponsive to any attempts at communication. The other collapsed entirely, unresponsive no matter how desperately we tried to awaken her. Normally, crying involves facial contortions, visible signs of internal emotional struggle. However, her face was eerily calm, as if those tears did not belong to her, forced out of eyes that showed no sign of pain. This incident abruptly ended our celebration. The unconscious girl was quickly carried away by a teacher who, along with a few instructors, rushed her to a military vehicle for emergency medical attention. Meanwhile, the other girl continued to cry silently, her body limp in a teacher's embrace, her arms dangling lifelessly at her sides. As the night deepened, when we were rushed back to our dormitories, she suddenly spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. A white shadow emerged from inside. Her words sent chills through every one of us, putting a horrifying end to what should have been an evening filled with laughter and joy. By the next morning, we were hastily sent home, the events of the previous night hanging over us like a dark cloud. It was only after the holiday ended and we gathered again that the continuously crying girl was mysteriously appointed as the class monitor. However, the girl who had fainted never returned to school. It wasn't until years later that I learned from others the full story of that night at the forbidden restroom, a story that confirmed our deepest fears. That evening, for some reason, the two girls had decided to venture to the normally off-limits restroom. Being forbidden, the restroom was devoid of light bulbs both inside and out, so they had to proceed in the dark, guided only by moonlight. The restroom was rudimentary, merely a trench dug into the ground without partitions. allowing a clear view of the entire interior from the doorway. At that moment, only the two of them were inside the restroom. The class monitor finished quickly and waited outside, casually chatting with the girl inside. Everything seemed peaceful until the other girl finally stepped out of the restroom, silently followed by a large white shadow, towering over both of them, who were about 1.6 meters tall. When the class monitor realized something was amiss and looked back, both stood frozen, unable to make a sound, just staring as the white shadow disappeared into the trees on the mountain. The courage it must have taken for them to return to the dining hall that evening was immense. After everyone dispersed that night, the class monitor was taken to the teacher's dormitory by a teacher. Once she had somewhat recovered, she relayed the incident to the teachers and instructors. However, the military instructors insisted that the white shadow they saw was the base's chef, appearing tall because of his chef's hat. No matter how much the class monitor insisted, the instructor remained unmoved, and the matter was left unresolved. That night, the class monitor adamantly refused to spend the night at the base, and was eventually taken home early by a teacher in a military vehicle. This incident cast a disquieting shadow over our military training experience, making us realize that within the seemingly tranquil routine of everyday life, there are mysteries we cannot explain, perhaps will never be able to explain. These experiences, like unsolved puzzles, constantly remind us that the world is far more complex than what we see and know. Not just a painting.
Ever since that unfortunate fall, which resulted in a broken leg, I've been confined to my home for a half-year-long convalescence. During these solitary days, I've re-encountered that hair-raising fear, but today I want to temporarily set aside this fear to share with you a deeply memorable story from my childhood. Reflecting back, it was an ordinary weekend bathed in sunshine when my mother and I decided to visit my Aunt Susan. She lived in a seemingly ordinary but slightly eerie old house. Susan's home was not spacious, featuring that typical old-style structure with thick stone walls surrounding 3 interconnected rooms. The center was a space used as a living room, flanked on either side by a bedroom and a small shed for storage. Upon entering her home, my attention was immediately captured by a row of posters on the living room wall. These were the popular large headshot posters from the 90s, showcasing the handsome faces and radiant smiles of then-popular stars. Although I was too young to truly understand who these stars were, their images, bathed in sunlight, appeared exceptionally dazzling, as if imbued with an indescribable charm. After lunch, feeling tired and my eyelids heavy, I was arranged to take a nap in my aunt's bedroom. I'm not sure how long I slept, but when I opened my eyes, everything was eerily silent, with only faint light filtering through the curtain gaps, casting mottled shadows on the old sewing machine as if time had stood still. I tried calling out, "Mom Tilda," but my voice echoed through the empty room, unanswered. At that moment, an inexplicable unease began to spread within me. Groping my way back to the living room, I found it deserted. The tables and chairs were neatly arranged, as if all signs of life had been meticulously erased. My unease gradually turned into fear as I walked into the yard, hoping to find anyone, but was met with deathly silence. The winter sun shone on me, but I felt no warmth. Attempting to push open the main door, I found it locked from the outside. At that moment, I felt an unprecedented sense of isolation. Returning to the living room once more, hoping to find something to distract me, my gaze involuntarily fell upon those celebrity posters on the wall, especially one poster, a woman with flowing long hair and large expressive eyes, her smile gentle and enchanting. I stared at the poster, seeking some comfort in this beautiful visage. However, as time passed, I began to feel as if those eyes were moving, seemingly following my every move. No matter how I turned, those eyes seemed to fixate on me, fear surged like a tide and I started swaying left and right, trying to confirm my imagination from different angles. But this action only intensified my fear, as the woman in the poster appeared to lock her incredible gaze on me, regardless of my movements. Just when I was about to collapse in terror, something unimaginable happened. I clearly saw the woman's mouth corners slowly lift, exceeding the range of normal human expression, until her smile distorted and her eyes seemed to stretch to an extreme, forming a horrifying curve. I screamed, my voice piercing the silence, and collapsed to the ground, overwhelmed by a fear I had never felt before. Just when I thought I was going to be consumed by this fear, hurried footsteps approached from outside. My mom and Susan rushed in to find me on the ground, tearfully pointing at the poster. Susan gently stroked my head, trying to comfort me, but her words did not alleviate my fear. Even after her explanation, when I bravely looked at the poster again, everything seemed to return to normal, with the woman's face once again wearing a gentle smile. But that fear had been deeply etched in my heart, and from then on, I never stepped foot in my aunt's house again. Even after many years, that fear has never left me. This experience, like a nightmare, is forever entwined in my memory, never to be forgotten.
Chewing in the shadows.
In a quiet little town, I spent my middle school years far from the care of my family, boarding alone at a school rich in history. The dormitory building, now dilapidated, was guarded only by a rusted iron gate. Right next to this gate was the dorm supervisor's room, and our dorm was next to it, facing a spacious courtyard. The school was rife with eerie tales about the dorms, which is why we always made sure to keep our doors firmly shut at night. It was a sleepless night when a strange noise woke me up. The door of our dorm was slightly ajar, letting in a sliver of faint light. Instinctively, I thought it might be a roommate returning, perhaps having forgotten to close the door. But then, I realized the sound was coming from beneath my bed, the sound of something eating. Terrified, I understood it couldn't be my imagination. The sound was too real, paralyzing me with fear at the thought of the unknown entity discovering I was awake. In the tense atmosphere, the bed frame suddenly squeaked, and the chewing sound abruptly stopped. What followed was an eerily bone-chilling silence, and then I heard something moving under the bed. My heart raced. I dared not open my eyes, fearing to witness something I shouldn't. Then, the door was pushed open further by the wind, making the old wooden door emit a ghastly creak. This gust of wind seemed to break the deadlock, and my curiosity overcame my fear. I decided to stealthily take a look. Ultimately, I saw a dark shadow swiftly dart out from under the bed and disappear through the door crack. After much contemplation, I found a reasonable explanation for that night's terrifying experience. A stray dog must have been lured by snacks that had fallen under the bed, and I, tempted by late-night food videos, couldn't resist heading to the kitchen for something to eat. In the darkness, as I ate, memories of that night became clearer, and fear once again surged through me. Now, even though I've tried to convince myself to forget that experience, whenever the night grows deep and silent, that same fear silently creeps back into my mind, making me once again feel the shadow of PTSD.
How I discovered my apartment might be possessed by a ghost.
Let me share with you a true story from my 20s, seemingly trivial but one that has stayed with me ever since. One evening, around 8 o'clock, I got home to find all my roommates were still out, leaving me alone in the apartment. As was my routine, I headed to the bathroom for a shower. The bathroom was spacious, and I liked to bring my smartphone with me to play TV shows, listening as I showered since my nearsightedness prevented me from seeing the phone's screen clearly without my glasses. The phone was placed at the entrance on the vanity. Despite usually being brave, even to the point of daring to live in a garage in Central Park when I interned in New York, because the internship paid little and the garage rent was cheap and it looked just like a normal room, that night I felt a bit scared. The thought of being alone in the house unsettled me, but I quickly reassured myself, what's there to be afraid of? It's not the first time. During the shower, I was probably watching The Crown when I suddenly felt like the characters were speaking at double speed. Being slightly scared at the time, I quickly went to the phone to listen closely, only to find the speed was normal, leading me to doubt my hearing. Months later, during the day while cooking in the kitchen, my phone, now closer to me and with my glasses on, suddenly played at double speed. I watched the screen showing double speed, knife and vegetables in hand, until it returned to normal and I continued chopping. I found this curious but not life-altering, assuming it was probably a glitch in the phone software and didn't think much of it. The second incident, however, remains inexplicable. It happened in the month I was moving out, at the end of the 12th month of my lease, around January. New York winters are cold, so I used to turn on my electric blanket every night before sleep. One night, after checking stocks on my phone and getting ready to sleep, I reached out to turn off the electric blanket only to find the switch was already in the off position. I put down the phone and, due to my job in audit, paying close attention to evidence and the completeness of evidence chains, I felt the temperature of the blanket because if it had been off for a while, the temperature would be different. The temperature indicated it had just been turned off, and the switch area was still warm, showing it was on just moments ago. Therefore, it couldn't have been that I accidentally turned it off while using my phone and forgot. Otherwise, the switch area would have cooled down in minutes. Plus, I was fully awake when looking at stocks, not in a drowsy state. This was puzzling, but without any explanation, I simply turned off the light and went to sleep. About 2 weeks later, one night, just like before, I played with my phone before planning to turn off the electric blanket. This time I paid special attention to the tactile sensation of turning it off, thinking to myself how distinct that resistance felt and that there was no way I could have missed it last time. Amazed by the mystery, I went to sleep. However, I woke up in the middle of the night feeling extremely hot, checked the time, and it was around 3 or 4 a.m. Wondering why the blanket was so hot, I reflexively reached for the switch, only to see the red light on, indicating it was on. I was instantly fully awake, remembering clearly that I had turned it off before bed, especially considering the tactile memory. So, I spent the early morning hours recalling the pre-sleep scenario, still sure I had turned it off. This time, I was a bit scared but gathered my courage, calmed myself, and went back to sleep. My electric blanket has 4 settings, and if I set it to the first, the highest temperature, it would automatically reduce to the second, third, and finally, the 4th setting over time. That night, when I woke up feeling hot, it seemed to be on the 3rd or 4th setting, though I wasn't sure. I could have calculated approximately when the blanket was turned back on by tracking how long each setting lasts, which would have disturbed me more if it turned out to be after I had fallen asleep. Later, due to the weekdays being busy with work, I didn't pursue this calculation, thinking knowing or not would only add to my worries. Now, I've moved to a new house and haven't experienced anything similar. My friends joked that a ghost might follow me when I move, to which I replied, I moved from the east to the west side of Manhattan, several miles, and it didn't tire following me all the way. That's about the extent of my story. An additional note, last night my mom was going back to our hometown in the Northeast to visit my late grandmother's grave and asked me to book a train ticket online. After purchasing it, I told her it was in car 3, seat 20. She was surprised and asked, "Car 3, seat 20?" I confirmed, and she said, "The day my grandmother passed away was March 20th.
a real Visti in a dream. I am a staunch atheist, but my atheism is not based on a complete denial of supernatural phenomena. Instead, it's rooted in a firm belief that science will ultimately be able to explain everything. I believe that even after humans pass away, they might continue to exist in some form of magnetic field. To me, the complexity of this world goes far beyond carbon-based life. Extraterrestrial life could exist in forms beyond our imagination, such as radio waves or magnetic fields. Let me tell you a true story from my youth. Since graduating from college, my life has been filled with changes. Job instability meant I had to move almost every year. But things went smoothly until last year. At the beginning of the pandemic, I rented a room near the subway station close to my workplace through a platform called Love My Home. I rented a master bedroom, which was sunny and felt great to live in. I only planned to stay there for a year since I would have to move again due to another job change. In April or May last year, when the pandemic was slightly easing, I experienced the first odd event. My grandmother passed away. My mother, a very filial person, was devastated by her death and struggled to recover for a long time. Since I had just changed jobs and the pandemic had just ended, I didn't go home for the funeral. I always told myself that seeing her one last time would have been best, but since I missed it, going back just for the funeral seemed meaningless. Deep down, perhaps because I didn't attend the funeral, I didn't truly feel the sorrow. Busy with work day after day, I hardly had time to stop and grieve. Then, one night, about 3 months after my grandmother's death, I suddenly dreamed of her. In the dream, we were sitting in a white room with a white bed. My grandmother told me she was leaving. At that moment, I felt an inexplicable sadness, even though there was no concept of life and death in the dream. I kept begging her not to leave, but she eventually turned into a beam of white light and disappeared. I woke up crying, unable to stop the tears or catch my breath. I turned on the light and realized it had been nearly 100 days since my grandmother left us. Perhaps through this dream, she was telling me she had completely left this world, whether entering reincarnation or waiting for her next life. This dream felt different, and instinctively I lifted my pillow, remembering the amulet my father had made for me. During a period of exhaustion and misfortune in another city, my father, half believing, had an amulet made to protect me. He even cut his finger accidentally during its making, thinking it might enhance its protective power. I always kept the amulet under my pillow in a specific direction, believing if there were any unclean presences, they would enter through the door, not the window. I was very particular about the amulet's placement, always checking to ensure it remained in the correct direction whenever I moved the pillow. However, on the night after the dream, I found the amulet had shifted positions. This change shocked me, as there was no way I could have done it in my sleep. The amulet had been with me for years without ever moving like this. Facing this phenomenon that science couldn't explain, the only conclusion I could draw was that perhaps my grandmother, in some form, had truly entered my dream. Only when the amulet's direction was altered could she enter my dream. This thought terrified me, as I couldn't explain why the amulet had moved. For the rest of that night, I was filled with fear, hardly able to sleep again. The next day, I shared this experience with my mother, hoping the story would convey that grandmother might have truly left us, searching for her next reincarnation. I also shared the peculiar change in the amulet. My mother asked if, as I said, the amulet's position could prevent unclean things from entering, then who had changed its direction? I joked that perhaps my grandmother had some magic that could turn the amulet from the outside before entering my dream. Though I tried to lighten the conversation with humor, deep down, I knew this unexplainable phenomenon would forever remain in my memory. Deformed Cub.
In my childhood, our village welcomed a beggar who was as thin as a rake, with blackened teeth and an unpleasant odor emanating from him. When he begged at our doorstep, my grandmother, moved by innate kindness, gave him a piece of bread. Holding the bread, the beggar issued a chilling prophecy. All pigs in the sty must be slaughtered to avoid the impending disaster. Our family's livelihood depended greatly on pig farming. The sale of pork and piglets brought us considerable income each year. My grandfather, practical and impatient with superstition, scoffed at the beggar's ominous warning. "Do you know how much a pig is worth? Nonsense! Get out of here!" He chased the beggar away from our home, sternly warning that it wouldn't just be a simple expulsion if he dared to return. Days later, my cousin George, the pride of our family and the only one pursuing higher education in the city, came home for the summer break. His arrival was a cause for celebration, and my grandfather decided to slaughter a pig for the occasion, inviting some people over to help. As they prepared to slaughter the sow, something unexpected happened. The sow suddenly began to give birth, revealing a piglet's tail. A shocked silence fell over the yard, and my grandfather's face showed confusion. Our neighbor, Mr. Wilson, questioned the decision to slaughter a pregnant sow, suggesting a mistake might have been made. My grandfather, puzzled and insistent, claimed he hadn't bred the sow. My grandmother quickly intervened, cutting the ties and urging, "Quick, bring her back to the sty to give birth." Together they managed to move the sow back to the sty. "You and your memory," my grandmother teased, despite my grandfather's stubborn refusal to admit his mistake. Mr. Wilson tried to lighten the mood, commenting that more piglets meant good fortune, hinting there could be 8 or even 10. Their casual chat filled the sty as they awaited the outcome of the birth. However, the birthing process seemed troubled. The piglets struggled to be born. My grandmother became anxious, using scissors to assist, while telling me, "Ben, go fetch a basin of hot water." I ran back to the house, where my cousin George was engrossed in his books. "Aren't you coming to see the piglets being born?" I asked. "What's there to see about piglets being born?" "I'm not going," he replied dismissively, reflecting his status as the family's intellectual. In the sty, my grandmother struggled to aid the sow's birthing, but the results were disheartening. The first piglet was born incomplete, its body gruesomely severed. My grandmother was shocked. "What's happening?" My grandfather joined her, inspecting the malformed piglet, while Aunt Lee lamented the loss. The subsequent births were equally horrifying, each piglet more deformed than the last, as if mauled by an unseen predator. Just when we thought the nightmare was over, the sow let out a piercing scream, announcing the birth of another piglet, much larger than the others. My grandmother gripped the piglet's legs, slowly pulling it out. To our horror, its head bore a disturbing resemblance to a human face, covered in fine black fuzz. My grandmother stood up, her voice filled with fear. What is this?" My grandfather, pale-faced, attempted to rationalize. "It's just a deformed piglet, nothing to worry about." Amidst the unease, I hurriedly fetched George, urging him to see the monstrosity for himself. His response was immediate and decisive: "Kill it." This request marked a rare break from his usually composed demeanor, sparking a flurry of activity and chaos in the sty. Debates and disputes over the piglet's fate ensued, with undercurrents of fear and superstition threatening to overwhelm the rationality and pride that had long defined our family. My cousin, a man of books, usually mild-mannered and rarely prone to outbursts, shocked everyone in the sty with his sudden roar. My grandfather, confused, asked, "George, what are you saying?" George, my cousin, whom we affectionately called Joe, glared with angry red eyes, scanning the surroundings, and demanded, "Give me a knife, get me a knife." My grandfather firmly grasped his arm, sternly questioning, "What are you trying to do? Have you lost your mind?" From my grandfather's tone, it was clear that if George continued his antics, he might actually take action. George calmed down slightly under my grandfather's stern gaze. Seeing the situation turning sour, the others in the sty began to leave, laughing off the tense moment. My grandmother, with an apologetic smile, said, "Sorry for the trouble. We'll make it up to you next time we slaughter a pig." Her idea of compensation was offering a few pounds of pork as a token of gratitude. After they left, only the four of us remained in the sty. My grandfather released George, not without scolding. "What madness got into you with so many people around?" George firmly replied, "I'm not mad. That deformed piglet should be killed. Do you really want to keep it?" The malformed piglet, though grotesquely shaped, was clearly still breathing. If brought inside and cared for a few days, it might survive. My grandmother placed the malformed piglet beside the sow, allowing it to nurse. But the already weak sow, upon seeing the deformed piglet, stood up, retreated to a corner, and let out a pitiful howl. This sound triggered panic among the other pigs in the sty. They seemed terrified of the malformed piglet, with some sows even jumping out of their pens. My grandfather cursed, "What in the world is going on?" George scoffed, "See, even the sow is afraid of it. It should be killed." My grandmother examined the malformed piglet carefully, and I too moved closer. Just then, George suddenly snatched the piglet from my grandmother's hands and threw it to the ground, resulting in a loud thump. Blood flowed from underneath the piglet, some splashing onto George's face. He smiled. "There, all settled now." Before my grandparents could react, George had already run out of the sty. My grandfather, frowning deeply, chased after him, while my grandmother hurriedly followed, saying, "Let's talk this out. Don't lay hands on him." I was left alone in the sty, witnessing a deformed piglet for the first time in my life. I couldn't help but lean in closer, noticing its head resembled a human's, and its front limbs were like human arms, its hooves curled like 5 fingers. As I reached out to touch it, the piglet suddenly opened its eyes, revealing a sinister smile. It seemed it wasn't dead. Terrified, I ran out. "Grandfather, grandmother, the piglet seems to be alive." Entering the house, I saw George, his face flushed from a recent slap. My grandfather, Frank, sat on an old wooden bench smoking a pipe, silent for a while before slowly speaking. "Did you really not do this?" George, emotionally charged, loudly responded, "Of course not. I'm a human, not a beast." Tears welled up in his eyes, showing his hurt before he ran to another part of the house. Our home was not small, with 2 buildings front and back. My grandmother, Alice, sitting on an old kitchen chair, frowned at me. "What's not dead?" I replied, "The deformed piglet, it's still alive. It can even smile." She didn't believe me, stood up and said, "Nonsense." Despite my fear, I followed her back to the sty. Upon arrival, the deformed piglet was gone. Only a pool of blood remained. My grandmother sensed an ominous sign, loudly calling me, "Ben, go get your grandfather." After saying this, she picked up a broom from the ground, cautiously scanning the area as if searching for the piglet. I rushed out, calling loudly, "Grandfather, grandmother needs you. Quickly come to the sty." Grandfather hurried out from the house, joining me back at the sty. "What happened?" Grandmother turned to him, gravely saying, "The deformed piglet is missing. We need to search." They searched the sty with brooms in hand but found no trace of the piglet. Grandfather speculated, could a weasel have taken it? Grandmother didn't reply, her gaze fixed on every corner of the sty. After several fruitless minutes, Grandfather finally said, "Let's forget it and make dinner." Grandmother put down her broom, agreeing, "All right, I'll start cooking. You clean up the sty." Grandfather nodded, beginning to tidy up, while Grandmother and I walked out of the sty together. During dinner, Grandmother had prepared the meal and asked me to call George. His room door was locked, and he didn't respond to my knocks, clearly still upset. Grandfather said, "Ben, "Come eat. Leave him. Let him be hungry." Grandmother nudged grandfather, signaling him to stop. She gently called, "George, come eat. Hurry." The door remained closed, unresponsive. Grandmother sighed, scooping a bowl of food from the pot. "I've left the food in the pot for you. Come eat if you're hungry." Grandfather then picked up a bottle of wine, taking a sip, impatiently saying, "Forget about him. Let's eat." Late at night, I suddenly felt a stomach ache and needed to use the toilet. I carefully got up, put on my shoes. Grandmother woke up, asking, "What are you doing?" I replied, "Going to the toilet." She softly instructed, "Put on a coat before you go out." She fell back asleep, while grandfather's snoring continued. I quietly opened the door to the outer room and found it was left open. Perhaps grandmother forgot to lock it. I rushed to the toilet. Just as I was about to leave, I heard noises from the sty, not like fighting or normal pig sounds, but more like mating. Hastily finishing up, I saw George walking out of the sty, looking pleased. I was about to call him when I noticed his shadow appeared as a standing, walking pig. This sight chilled me to the bone. I instinctively covered my mouth. Just then, George turned, noticing me. He asked, "What are you doing?" My eyes fixed on George's shadow, which now returned to a normal human shape. I wondered if I had seen wrong. Seeing I didn't respond, George said, "Why are you out here so late? Come here." I approached, telling him I had just been to the toilet. Before I could finish, George suddenly leaned in, asking in a cold tone, "What did you see just now?" I felt uneasy, unsure why. Instinctively wanting to retreat, I was grabbed tightly by George. He roared, "What did you see?" In the moonlight, I saw George's shadow transform into the standing pig again. Terrified, I was about to scream when I heard my grandfather's voice from inside. "Ben, aren't you coming back to sleep?" George seemed startled by grandfather's voice too. I took the chance to break free and hurried back inside. I closed the door, leaning against it, my forehead covered in cold sweat. Grandmother turned on the light, concerned. "Ben, what's wrong?" I curled up on the bed, shaking. Grandmother asked worriedly, "What happened? Talk to me." She pulled back the blanket covering my head, and I stammered, I was at the toilet. I saw George. His shadow. It was a standing pig. Immediately, grandfather kicked me, angrily saying, "Stop talking nonsense." I felt deeply wronged. I'm not lying. It was really a pig's shadow. Grandfather raised his hand, looking like he was about to hit me. I quickly hid behind grandmother, avoiding the blow. Grandfather glared at me, sternly warning, "If you talk nonsense again, see if I don't beat you to death. Go to sleep." Grandmother frowned, softly comforting me. "The child might have seen wrong. It's nothing serious. Why are you so angry?" Grandfather turned off the light, grumpily saying, "In the entire village, only our George has made something of himself, gone to university. How many people are envious? If this gets out, who knows how it'll be twisted, smearing George." Grandmother didn't respond, seemingly agreeing with grandfather. After a while, she gently patted my back, comforting me. "Ben, we can't talk about this. Go to sleep." Grandfather and grandmother didn't believe me. I even started doubting myself. Did I really see wrong? But George's behavior just then was too strange, not at all like him. The next morning, I was woken by grandmother's crying. I put on my shoes and ran outside. The yard was crowded with people gathered in a circle. I squeezed through, seeing George. He was dead. Half his head was bitten off, his legs severely damaged, his death terribly gruesome. The villagers said George had fallen into the pigsty and was bitten to death by the pigs. Yet I had seen him just last night.